Today is October 19th. It's the 293rd day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. Foresight and changing attitudes eventually lead to the passage of legislation creating a division in the United States Navy known as WAVES. WAVES stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Services. Signed into law in July 1942, it will be another 14 and a half months before the Navy integrates WAVES, affording African American women the opportunity to volunteer. On this day, in 1944, Harriet Ida Pickens and Frances Eliza Wills are the first to answer the call. Harriet, working as a public health administrator, is encouraged to join WAVES by her father, William Pickens, one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Frances is a social worker. She has no brothers who can serve in the war effort, so she feels it's her duty to enlist. Together, the women attend the Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School at Northampton, Massachusetts. Graduating in November 1944, they become the first African American WAVES officers. Frances goes on to teach naval history and administers classification tests as a commissioned officer. Harriet leads physical training sessions at the Hunter Naval Training Station at Hunter's College in the Bronx, New York. This is the main training facility for enlisted WAVES recruits. By the time World War II ends in September 1945, there are still just 2 African American officers and 72 enlisted out of the 80,000 members of WAVES. Creating WAVES takes much effort and the changing of minds among those in leadership within the Navy and the government. WAVES is initially fashioned into the 1941 legislation that establishes a Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, also known as WACS, in which women serve the Army but not in the Army. There's a debate over whether this is the right approach. The Navy also isn't convinced there's a need for women within their ranks. However, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics believes otherwise. They feel that indeed there is a need for women in the Navy. If passed, WAVES legislation will allow women to replace men in their shore activities, freeing the men up for sea duty and combat for the duration of the war, plus 6 months. After much discussion and debate, President Roosevelt signs the WAVES legislation into law on July 30, 1942. The WAVES become an official part of the U.S. Navy, holding the same rank and ratings as their male counterparts. They receive equal pay and are subject to military discipline. Restricted from serving aboard combat ships or aircraft, they serve in 900 shore stations in the continental U.S. This is eventually expanded to include the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. The first class of WAVES consists of 644 women. They complete a 12-week training course that includes 8-hour days of classroom study. WAVES graduate as yeomen and are trained for only secretarial and clerical functions. However, the results of WAVES exceeds expectations, and by the fall of 1942, the Navy produces 10,000 women for service. The Navy also expands the areas of service for WAVES to include occupations in aviation, medical, intelligence, communications, and science and technology. Diverse images of the WAVES appear on posters, billboards, and in magazines. But not all women are allowed to volunteer, and the Navy comes under fire for excluding African Americans. Public Law 689 that creates WAVES does not outright specify that African American women are barred from service. For most of the war, they're just denied the opportunity to do so. Civic, religious, and civil rights organizations urge the Navy to recruit African American women. Citizens send letters and petitions to President Roosevelt and Secretary of the Navy William Knox. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt holds a meeting with military and civilian leaders to discuss the issue. Not much movement happens until after Knox dies and James Forrestal succeeds him as Secretary of the Navy. Under Forrestal's leadership, both WAVES and the Navy Nurses Corps finally become integrated. Following World War II, racial and gender discrimination and segregation continues in the military. President Harry S. Truman issues Executive Order 9981, eliminating segregation, quotas, and discrimination in the armed forces. African American women are allowed to pursue careers in the U.S. Navy under new affirmative action policies and evolving attitudes. During the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, African American women serve alongside women of other racial backgrounds, playing crucial roles in the medical field, technology, intelligence, and combat. Harriet Ida Pickens and Frances Eliza Wills paved the way for them thanks to the Navy's decision to integrate their WAVES program. On this day in 1944. Born on this day in 1931, English author of thrillers and spy novels, John le Carré. Le Carré is born David Cornwell in Dorset, England. When he's a little boy, his mother leaves home, abandoning young David and his brother and sister. His father is still around, at least when he's not in jail. Ronnie Cornwell is a con man and gangster, an associate of the infamous Carré brothers, the twin organized crime bosses who terrorized London in the 1950s and 60s. David and his brother are often enlisted to help their dad avoid creditors and bailiffs, dabbling at an early age in, as he puts it, clandestine survival. So begins his fascination with secrets and deception. Dad Ronnie makes a fortune and loses a fortune a number of times during David Cornwell's childhood. When Ronnie is up, David attends boarding school, first in England and then in Switzerland, where his fascination with espionage begins. He does his national service in the Army's Intelligence Corps, interviewing those who've escaped from the East. He then studies languages at Lincoln College in Oxford, until Ronnie's fortune is squandered, at which time David takes a job teaching at a boys' prep school. While at Oxford, though, he works on the side for MI5, infiltrating leftist student groups to identify Soviet spies. In 1958, Cornwell joins MI5 full-time, and then in 1960 transfers to MI6 and is posted to Germany around the time the Berlin Wall is erected. It's also around this time that he begins writing. Because he's active duty in the Foreign Intelligence Service, his first novel, A Call for the Dead, must be published under a pseudonym. He publishes the book under the pen name John le Carré in 1961, taking the French word for the square as his pseudonym. His third novel, published in 1963, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, sells incredibly well, wins a number of awards, and is adapted as the 1965 film of the same name starring Richard Burton. Le Carré leaves the intelligence business to write spy novels full-time in 1964. He actually has no choice but to leave the service. He's one of many in MI6 who are betrayed by Soviet spy and British intelligence mole Kim Philby. Kim Philby, who later will be the inspiration for the character codenamed Gerald, the subject of the mole hunt in le Carré's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He parlays his short career in the intelligence field into a lengthy and lucrative career writing Cold War thrillers acclaimed for their authenticity and excellence. And he leads a life that is filled with as much deception as the stories he writes. He has several affairs over the years, in part because, as he explains it, he often feels trapped and runs. He says, quote, "I was by nature a defector, a bolter. I came from bolting stock. My mother bolted when I was 5 and stayed bolted for the rest of my childhood. My father bolted of necessity for most of his life, often from the arm of the law and sometimes unsuccessfully. I myself bolted from an English public school at 16, from the burdens of bachelorhood at 23, from the twilight world of British intelligence at 33, and from a first marriage at 36. An instinct simultaneously to engage in life and escape from it is not unusual in creative people, but I have it in spades. While the patriot and child in me rushed to embrace one great institution after another, so the would-be artist was already secretly packing his bags, tunneling under the castle walls and testing the depth of the moat." John le Carré, born David Cornwell on this day in 1931, has published nearly 24 novels, plus an assortment of screenplays, short stories, and nonfiction books to date. There's 73 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. Today's episode, co-written by Elizabeth Schultz. Born on this day in 1969, one half of the team that brings you South Park in nearly real time every week. Trey Parker. Check out the documentary 6 Days to Air that takes you behind the scenes of a South Park episode from conception to completion in 6 days. It's insane how quickly Trey and Matt make that show. So if you're still listening, oh my God, they killed Kenny. Talk to you tomorrow.